and welcome to Think Watercolour. Today I'm going to be painting from this reference photograph of, I think it's Harbour Light on the sea defences. Not sure whereabouts in the world. It's a download from Unsplash. I think the photographer's name is Tina Rolfe, but I'll put a link in the description below. The thing that attracted me on this photograph was the stark contrast between this bright orange light and the darkening sky with storm clouds brewing and the waves crashing. Crashing waves are always a bit of a challenge for a watercolourist. Much easier to paint in oils because in oils you work from dark to light and you can apply white paint over darker images. In watercolour, not quite so easy. So what I'm going to do is use some masking fluid. I'm not a great lover of masking fluid, but I'm going to use some in these areas where the rocks are reflecting the light. The light's coming from here, and you can see it's hitting the side of the structure here. So I'm going to use some masking fluid just on the edge. I'm not going to mask any of these areas because they're large enough for me to paint loosely around, but things like these little reflections on the sea defence rocks, I'm just going to mask those out with some fluid, as I say. Trick with masking fluid, a couple of tips. See here I've got a small ramekin. You can just see there's some liquid soap. Washing up liquid would do equally well, or just that you can run the damp brush on a bar of soap just to protect it from the masking fluid. It makes it easier to clean. You don't need much, there's a tiny amount in there. The other trick with masking fluid is never shake the bottle. If you haven't used your masking fluid for a while, just give it a stir. I've already done this, but just give it a stir with the end of your brush, wipe it clean. Don't stir it too much, and definitely don't shake it. You'll end up with a bottle full of bubbles. Just a little tip. So without further ado, I'll get started. Just move the photograph up so I can keep reference. So the trick is just damp the brush a little bit, not too much, and then just put some soap on. It's probably too much this. I'm just going to wipe it off on some towel, but it retains the soap within the hairs, and then you can happily dip it into the masking fluid and apply it to your painting. Now this is quite a laborious process, so I'm not going to film the whole thing. I'm just going to show you roughly where I'm putting it. Just putting it on these highlight areas on these rocks so that it protects them from the washes that I'm going to apply. I'm going to work from light to dark, so these rocks I'm going to paint the lightest grey first, let that dry, and then I'll add the darker greys, but I need to mask these areas out so that I can retain these little patches of white. So I'll turn the camera off and I'll come back once I've finished doing that. I'm also going to put some masking fluid just down the edge of this structure, just a small amount, just so I can keep that really clean, because when I paint the sky I don't want to lose that whiteness on the edge. Okay, the masking fluid is now dry, and I've laid the board flat because I don't want the pigment draining down due to gravity. I'm just wetting the sky area because I want to paint this dark, brooding, stormy sky, and I need the pigment to really stay at the top as much as possible. The bottom of the sky where it meets the sea is quite bright, and there's waves crashing on the right as well, so I'm not worried about getting too much pigment there, but so that's why the board's flat. This is a mixture of Prussian blue and some permanent rose just to deaden the greenness of the Prussian blue, and a touch of burnt sienna to create this grey sky colour. I want it to be darkest at the top, and I will add more and more pigment as I go along. This is Saunders Waterford 300 gram rough high white paper. It's a nice bright white paper which is ideal for these crashing waves, which I'll be painting later. Just making sure I go over the glass area of the light with the cloud colour, and as I come down, keeping it fairly light. I may have to darken this later in the painting. I think it's going to dry a bit too light for me, but for the purposes of the demonstration, it's a good exercise in underpainting with dark colours. Just dabbing off with a clean paper towel at the base. Just adding a little bit more pigment on the left hand side. On this right hand side, the wave is crashing, and so it's going to be pretty white. I'm going to let this dry before carrying on. For the foreground rocks, this is a mixture of ultramarine and burnt sienna. It's going to dry much lighter than this, but it's the first wash of the lightest parts of the rocks, other than where I've put the masking fluid. That's the point of the masking fluid. It means I can paint fairly loosely over these rocks and just really scribble the initial tone in. It's going to be much darker in places later in the painting, so I'm just more interested in just getting a light wash in at this stage. I'm just going to soften the edges of this side of the rocks, because that's where the crashing waves are spraying, and some of the edges will be sharp and you can see them, but other areas will be covered in spray, so just softening those edges a little bit. I'm just mixing up the green for the sea. This is, again, it's ultramarine and burnt sienna, but I'm going to add some viridian to just make it a bit greener, and some cadmium yellow just to get that green colour that I want for the sea. It's quite a dark, stormy looking sea, and if you're an observer of the sea, it reflects the colour of the sky to some extent, so it changes colour all the time, and this is a pretty dark green stormy sea, as I said, so just blocking in the initial wash for that, leaving lots of white for the foam areas where the sea has crashed along the rocks and washed back into the incoming waves. It'll all become clearer a bit later once I start adding some of the darks. And while the paint's still wet, just adding a little bit more pigment in areas just to vary the tone. It's not one flat colour, so just a bit of variety in tone. And I will be adding darker areas once this is dry, and I'll be able to see what I need to do to change it. I'll also be towards the end of the painting, I'll probably be adding some white gouache just to indicate the foaming sea. This is a mixture of pyrrole orange and cadmium yellow for the lighthouse structure. It's much darker on the left, which is in shadow, and the structure itself has got a variety of grey areas where the paint's worn away. Just lightening the mix as moved to the right where the masking fluid is for the brightest reflection of the light coming through. Just darkening the left hand side here, a bit more pigment. This is cobalt blue and burnt sienna, just to make the grey up for the areas of the lighthouse that are damaged due to the weather. You know, the surface of the paint's been affected by the constant crashing of the waves. So there are grey areas where the paint's disappeared. I've let the initial wash dry, and I'm just adding some stronger colours to suggest the roundness of the building. Just creating that three-dimensional effect with paint and light. For the wall behind the lighthouse, this is a mixture, again it's basically ultramarine and burnt sienna, and the top of the wall is fairly clearly defined against the skyline, but because it's covered in spray and foam, what I'm going to do is just use some clear water just to dilute it down. It helps to just suggest that it's there, but you can only see the edge of it because of the spray from below. And the same applies here really. I'm just diluting the pigment so that it shows that there's a structure there, but it's hidden by spray. This area on the left is really dark and it's not affected by the spray, and it makes a nice contrast with the rest of the painting. And this part of the structure is in deep shadow. Again, this helps to create this contrast between the sea spray and the structure. The same applies to these boulders and rocks that are there have been put there by man for the sea defences. These are man-made structures, and again it's just a question of softening the area below the part that you can actually see through the spray. Just helps to define what's there, and just dabbing out a little bit with some kitchen towel. Just darkening some of the edges that, as they get closer to us, become more visible. Here I'm just putting in some of the same colour, but very weak, just for the shadows in the spray. And just softening the edges with a clean damp brush. Although it's a challenge to paint sea spray, it's once you get the hang of how to do it, it's not that difficult. As you can see, it's the image starts to come together just by really looking at what you're painting and just developing the softness of the spray. Just putting in the shadow on the sea here, where it's in the shade, and it just helps to define the image. Just adding some of the green and then taking it out with a clean towel just to suggest the horizon. It's buried in deep spray from the crashing waves, so I don't want it too heavily defined. This is a stronger mix of ultramarine and burnt sienna for the darkest parts of the rocks. I try not to be too specific when I'm painting things like this, because if you try and follow the reference photograph slavishly, it would end up being laboured and difficult. It's just to create the idea of light and shade in the rocks. Once you start putting the darker shadows in, the painting starts to take shape. And looking at the strength of these these dark shadows in the foreground, I think I'm going to have to darken the sky a little bit later. I'll do that at the end because it just looks a bit weak. Just putting in some of the details of the structure with some fairly neat orange. Just a balustrade around the light at the top. And a ladder down the side of the structure. Once you start putting in these finishing details, the painting starts to come together, and it adds structure and depth to the image. This bright orange light against the dark sky, well, it will be dark once I repaint it, against the sky and against the rocks, adds that contrast, warm against cold, dark against light. Just a few more details of some railings and ladders on the side of the structure here. Now for the spray, I'm using an old toothbrush, and you notice I hold it vertical to the page. If you put it at an angle, the splatter for the sea doesn't look real. So the trick is to keep it vertical or at right angles to the page, and it's just basically white gouache on the old toothbrush and just dragging a palette knife across it, and it creates this splatter. I mean, this is a pretty stormy sea and there's a lot of splatter, so just taking the time, and the trick is not to overdo it, but at the same time you've got to get enough on so that it demonstrates the waves crashing. And here I'm using a rigger brush with some white gouache, fairly neat gouache, to just to put a little bit of more detail in the foam in the sea. Again, you have to know when to stop. Try not to overdo it. It's very easy to do too much. I've mixed up a much stronger mix for the sky now. I just thought it was too light. It needs that contrast. So I'm just blocking in with a much darker wash over the initial wash, which helps to create this really dark, brooding sky. Just helps with the contrast and reflects better the look of the painting. Just dabbing out with a kitchen towel, then adding maybe a bit more pigment in areas. It's just a question of playing around with it while it's wet until you're happy with the effect that you're getting. Just adding a little bit more shadow in areas of the sky. Just darkening the sky just adds that bit more contrast to the whole painting. And the purpose of this demonstration is really to show how you can suggest crashing waves with not a great deal of effort. It's just a question of leaving lots of white paper, a bit of spatter and a bit of blending. I think we're done. I hope you got something from this demonstration. A little bit rushed today, but it's an exercise in painting the sea, crashing waves, and a little bit of contrast in terms of composition with the orange against the dark grey sky. The rocks make leading lines in. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you learnt something from it, please give the video a like. It always helps with YouTube. Do subscribe and hit the notification bell for future videos.